Funding for this program was made possible by WQED's members, the Allegheny Regional Asset District, and the Pittsburgh Foundation. Thank you.
Smoke couldn't go up. It couldn't dissipate.
The Donora Smog of 1948.
It was, unfortunately, a recipe for a disaster.
We've preserved the memories of people who lived through a local tragedy.
There were a lot of people dying.
That sparked national debate.
9 Mile Run used to be referred to as Stink Creek.
Also featured a contemporary comeback.
There was almost nothing living in the stream.
But it's running clean now, a model of success far beyond Pittsburgh.
It just seemed appropriate to come here and see what influenced her, and as she was a native Pittsburgher.
And you'll visit the home of a local woman who took on corporate America when few others would.
The public was being asked to accept these chemicals and did not have the whole picture.
These are stories of environmental neglect that led to positive change.
Only that could really bring the stream back to health.
In our water,
The nation learned quite a bit.
our land,
People understood that they had to do something different.
and air.
It looked like the foggiest day that you could imagine.
What happened is the smoke couldn't go up. It couldn't dissipate.
They were panting, and they were scared to death.
People became aware that there were a lot of people dying.
And it was, unfortunately, a recipe for a disaster.
Let's go to press. Donora, Pennsylvania. Health officials now fear an ammonia epidemic in Donora, where the death toll from a smothering fog has reached 20.
It was the fall of 1948 when that deadly smog descended on Donora. Toxic fumes from a zinc plant and other nearby mills hung over the area for 5 days. When rain finally cleared the air, 20 people had died. Thousands more were sickened. Today, most people don't know about the Donora Smog. Some know it as a footnote in history, and very few know how the tragedy changed the way we live and breathe, except for those who lived through it.
Just can't get over the green over there in Webster on top of the hill. Everything was dark brown, was dirt.
Yep.
Jean Davis is back home. She hasn't seen Donora in decades. Jean raised her family there and returned with her daughter Deborah for a look at the old neighborhood.
I remember the house was there where your mom lived, and she
They
got
talk
sick.
about the Donora of
Just
yesterday.
my mom. We all grew up there.
They remember life in a small town settled on the steep hills above the Monongahela River.
You know, I used to walk up and down these steps 4 times a day to go to Kastner School on 10th Street.
How many steps were there?
105.
105. Why'd you keep counting them?
I don't know. I guess it helped pass the time.
For Jean, this homecoming is about more than memories. She walks with a sense of pride because of her daughter, Deborah Davis, student at Donora's old Sampson Star School, graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, epidemiologist, and one of the leading authorities on environmental dangers. Davis is now telling the Donora story in her book, When Smoke Ran Like Water, Tales of Environmental Deception and Pollution.
We had great hills for sliding down because, of course, nothing grew on many of them. They were just barren dirt and kind of steep, like right here.
Growing up in Donora, Deborah Davis thought the smoky skies and dusty hillsides were normal.
Well, if you lived here, it smelled just fine.
She never noticed the stunted trees or the stink of the mills.
People would come to the town and they'd say, "What's that smell?" And people who lived here would say, "What smell?" And my grandpa would say, "Well, it smells like money."
The Donora Zinc Works was making money, and like the mills in most steel towns, it loomed large in the community, physically and economically. The plant pumped out salaries, along with smoke and toxins, 24 hours a day.
The zinc plant actually was over there. Of course, now you can't see it because it's so green. And it had stacks that were 110 feet high.
Everyone in the valley knew those stacks emitted something unhealthy, and all they had to do was follow the smoke, which usually blew across the river to the small community of Webster.
Webster was right downwind of the plume from the zinc works. It was totally barren.
Treeless hills, soot-covered buildings, in the shadow of a hulking structure on the riverbank. Ugly by today's standards. But the people of Donora chose to celebrate the beauty of the zinc works and its contribution to the community.
When the mills were working, people had jobs. And this was a hard-working town. People who lived in Donora had to be pretty hardy.
Not hardy enough, though, to withstand what happened just before Halloween in 1948, when a deadly air inversion settled over the valley.
These hills here, they're not very high, but they're high enough that the cold, heavier air rolling off those hills could smack down the hot fumes coming out of those zinc stacks, so that you had a static level of air sitting there over those hot fumes for 5 days.
At first, nobody noticed. Visibility was just worse than usual.
It was around Halloween time, and the kids were all excited. They were in a parade, and you didn't have to make it spooky. It was already spooky because you couldn't see very much. It had a very eerie feeling.
The football game went on because nothing ever stopped football in Donora or Monongahela.
Bernie Richardson, Joe Budiseski, Mario Perfetto, myself, Andy Kazemka.
Tony Romantino remembers his high school teammates like it was yesterday. He played right guard for the Donora Dragons in what some call the best football game that was never seen, the Dragons against the Monongahela Wildcats. Tony says practice at Legion Field the day before was especially bad.
We lined up for kickoff. One team on the 40, the other team on the other 40. There's 20 yards that separate us. Could not see each other. Could not see each other.
Despite the fog, the rivals went at it. Fans packed the stadium, and Mon City won.
They gave us our worst whipping in 3 years. We were not focused. I mean, there were too many things happening.
Word was starting to spread. The blanket of fog was making people sick. Still, sulfur, carbon monoxide, and heavy metal dust kept pouring out of the plant.
I was a nurse at the Donora Mill.
Eileen Loftus was a young woman then, in charge of the nursing staff. She was called to duty when gasping mill workers crowded the infirmary.
And my mother said, "Don't go to work." I said, "I have to go to work."
Even at the age of 85, Eileen says she'll never forget walking to the plant through a blinding cloud.
So I walked up Thompson Avenue to 8th Street, and I touched the houses as I went along to make sure I was still on the sidewalk. And I just felt my way along the fence. I couldn't see. But in no time, the hospital was jammed. I even put some of them on the floor. I had to because there was no place. They wanted to know if they were going to live or what, and I said, "You're going to live if I can help it." But I talked to them, and I sort of eased their minds a little bit.
You think this was used as a temporary morgue?
Yes.
When the funeral homes ran out of space, bodies were taken to the community center, and emergency workers struggled to keep the death count from rising.
The fire bells rang, alerting us to an alarm.
Bill Shemp no longer answers fire alarms. He spends his days tinkering with the classic 1947 fire truck that he's proudly restored. Bill has served the Donora Fire Department for 56 years. That's him 20 years ago, when a building caught fire on McCain Avenue. Here's Bill on a vintage fire truck in 1948.
And I was young and wanting to do all I could.
48 was the year Bill Schempp carried oxygen to smog victims, door to door, on foot, because he couldn't see to drive.
I had to feel my way. There was no way that you could see where you were going. I had a handkerchief that was wet. I had part of it in my mouth and the rest was over my nose. I got to the point of where I was on the verge of panic myself, because once I started, I had no idea of where I was. The town was shut down and people were not out on the streets. They were all in their homes and told to keep their windows closed. You would be amazed at how eerie the feeling was. It was a sensation. There was no noise, no nothing. There were no vehicles operating at all.
"20 funerals, grieving families, national headlines. That's what it took to temporarily shut down the zinc plant. And there was no real way of proving cases of long-term exposure.
At that time, I was going to junior high school in Donora. I was in 9th grade.
Dmitri Petro is a doctor now. He set up practice in his hometown.
Now I'm seeing a lot of people with chronic lung disease who live in this Mon Valley area as a result of all the mills.
The death certificate said heart attack.
Football player Tony Romantino's father worked at the zinc plant and died just weeks after the smog lifted.
I can't say for certain that he died because of the smog, but it did have an effect on him. It slowed him down.
A federal team moved in to examine the survivors and test the air. The Donora Zinc Works finally closed for good. The town gathered to watch its demolition. But there was no celebration. The smog victims are now faded images in old newspapers. Names long forgotten by most, but their deaths sent the world a message that still lives today.
Oh, I don't think they died in vain. I think, in fact, we saw the beginnings of a lot of legislation to clean up the air. And in fact, the whole Allegheny County, Pittsburgh area became a leader in clean air legislation.
It brought a lot of things to life. They had the federal government come in with representatives. It made the people begin to realize what they were breathing.
The nation learned quite a bit. That led, the deaths in Donora led to the passage of the Clean Air Act.
People understood that they had to do something different. I mean, Donora was a healthy, working-class population, and if people here who were steel workers and football players would die from pollution, this was a very serious problem.
We had a sense of community, and they were really not aware of the fact that living here was really treacherous to your health. I had many good friends.
Yeah. People took care of one another.
Rain, when hitting any hard surface, runs and runs into the streets, down the storm drain, then into our waterways.
Anyone who grew up in this area will tell you that 9 Mile Run used to be referred to as Stink Creek. It was very polluted with sewage and other types of pollutants. It was a very unattractive stream. It was deeply incised, lots of stream bank erosion. There was nothing, almost nothing living in the stream.
The willows look like they're doing good. The dogwoods are doing good.
Brenda Smith is the executive director of the 9 Mile Run Watershed Association. It was formed in 2001 to restore and protect the watershed through education and advocacy.
And it was almost impossible for any aquatic life to get established, even aside from the pollution, because of the enormous variation in flow every time it rained.
9 Mile Run is a small watershed taking drainage from Wilkinsburg, Edgewood, parts of Swissvale, and the city of Pittsburgh. Most of the stream is underground, except for a stretch that runs through Frick Park, flowing on to the Monongahela River.
There is natural groundwater that feeds it as well, but the reason that it's so high right now is because it's been raining this morning. One of the unique features of an urban stream is the great variation in flow. It's a unique challenge that we face, is that when it's raining, there's a much greater volume and velocity of water because of the stormwater coming into the stream.
The pictures you see here show how 9 Mile Run looked before 2002. For years, when it rained, the stormwater rushed into the creek, washing out the aquatic life, eroding its banks, and taking out native vegetation.
9 Mile Run was one of the first ecosystem restorations in the country that the Army Corps of Engineers did. That is to look at the stream, the riparian area, and the uplands area kind of as a holistic system to raise the functionality of that system back up to where it should be. I'm going to walk down through the bend. We did a fair amount of spot repairs in this bend.
Dave Derrick is a hydraulic engineer.
We're looking downstream. I'm in a pool.
He's with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which oversaw the $7.7 million restoration to 9 Mile Run. It was completed in 2006.
Keys on this right-hand side. We've got stone coming all the way down through there. We've got a solid line of willow that comes down to a point.
Now, Dave is back. He's checking out repairs made after a severe thunderstorm in June of 2009, which compromised the restoration.
This is an important project in a number of different reasons. One of them is this is a highly utilized park, and to a degree this stream is on display. There's a lot of people looking at it, and to me right now it's a fully functioning stream. It's definitely at this point one of the best urban stream realignments that I've seen in the country, bar none.
The restoration added meanders, more curves, and big rocks to slow the flow. Engineers also constructed the wetland by restoring native wildlife, plants, and trees. But now that the physical restoration is finished, the real work is just beginning.
Because of the problem with stormwater, it would take actions in the upper watershed to reduce the amount of stormwater going into the stream. It would take actions in the upper watershed to reduce the amount of litter coming into the stream, to reduce the amount of sewage in the stream. Only if citizens in the watershed became aware of their impact on the stream and took actions to change that, only that could really bring the stream back to health.
Their largest project is what they call the Rain Barrel Initiative. 1,400 homes in the upper watershed now have rain barrels, preventing stormwater from rushing down to 9 Mile Run, instead diverting it into their own lawns and gardens.
We're also starting a rain garden pilot project, which is a new approach that's taking place across Allegheny County, and we're spearheading it in this watershed, a new approach to residential stormwater management.
We're going to be removing 3 different invasive species.
These students are from Charter City High, and they're taking part in a service learning opportunity, Youth Training Days. The association partnered with Earth Force Incorporated, an organization that engages young people to become active environmental stewards, to bring students to the watershed to learn and help with the restoration. And these are some of the best tools in stormwater management: trees planted in the watershed neighborhoods. When these trees mature, each one can hold back between 3,000 to 4,000 gallons of rain. That's much less water that will pass over oily roads, landfills, gardens with fertilizer, lands soiled by animal waste.
So less of that pollution will be picked up and run into our streams and rivers, because once that water goes into a storm sewer and ends up in a stream and then in the river, that pollution that it carried is going right to someone else's drinking water supply.
The 9 Mile Run Watershed project is the Army Corps of Engineers' largest urban stream restoration project in the United States and is now a model for others across the country.
We wanted to show that it is possible, even in spite of the stormwater challenge that we face here, which is so different than in rural streams that are restored, that in spite of that, it is possible to bring back life into the stream.
This unassuming farmhouse in Springdale, northeast of Pittsburgh, was the home of a little girl who fell in love with the fields and woodlands that surrounded her. Her name was Rachel Carson. Years later, she wrote a book that changed the world.
The Springhouse Gardens are probably closest to what was here when Rachel's family lived here.
Patricia DeMarco's father gave her a copy of Silent Spring as a high school graduation gift. Now she serves as executive director of the Homestead where her childhood idol was born a century ago.
Up here there was the orchard, and the property of the Carsons went all the way to where the high school stands.
Young Rachel once had a clear view of the Allegheny River from her bedroom window. Her family's 65-acre farm extended to the shoreline.
And she went into the woods and the fields and learned about what she saw, what she found, was very observant as a child and enjoyed taking lessons from the birds and the insects and the plants as her sort of normal surroundings.
So we're going to head off into the nature trail this way.
Behind the house, Education Director Amanda Trapp leads a nature hike through a quarter-mile of woodland that once extended far beyond this hillside.
This is the jewelweed starting to pop up right here.
These visitors are members of the International Women's Association of Pittsburgh, a testament to the worldwide influence of America's most famous environmentalists.
I lived here in 1949 to 1952 when we built the house across the street.
Ralph Shoup was then a young man, newly married, with no inkling of the soon-to-be important footsteps he was following. Although
my father-in-law was the superintendent of schools here, and he did have her in class, without a doubt, one of the most literate kids that he'd had in school.
Rachel often joined her older brother and sister down on the riverbank. Her books about the ocean, including the sea around us, were influenced by those early years watching the river flow.
She wondered where it went, what kind of creatures were there, where they came from, and had a curiosity about the water and the interface between the water and the land from a very young age.
But the interface between man and nature produced her greatest work of all. Insecticides and other chemical poisons were celebrated as a panacea against agricultural pests in the years following World War II. But Rachel Carson didn't see it that way.
Chemicals are the sinister and little recognized partners of radiation in changing the very nature of the world, the very nature of its life. Since the mid-1940s, over 200 basic chemicals have been created for use in killing insects, weeds, rodents, and other organisms described in the modern vernacular as pests.
She wrote Silent Spring at the request of a friend who owned a nature preserve.
Her property was adjacent to an agricultural field, which was sprayed with DDT, and the cloud drifted over her nature preserve, and many of the birds died. And she wrote to Rachel pleading for some help and attention. And that was at about 1958, and Rachel began researching for that book at that time. And she began publishing Silent Spring as a serial in the New Yorker magazine. So by the time it went to press in 1962, she already had attracted considerable amount of attention from people like President Kennedy.
I think particularly, of course, it's Miss Carson's book, but they are examining the matter.
But her best-selling book also received ringing condemnation from chemical companies and their supporters. A leading critic was industry spokesman Dr. Robert White Stevens, who made his feelings clear in a 1963 documentary produced by CBS.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts. The real threat, then, to the survival of man is not chemical, but biological, in the shape of hordes of insects that can denude our forests, sweep over our croplands, ravage our food supply, and leave in their wake a train of destitution and hunger.
To these people, apparently, the balance of nature was something that was repealed as soon as man came on the scene. Well, you might just as well assume that you could repeal the law of gravity. The balance of nature is built of a series of interrelationships between living things and between living things and their environment. You can't just step in with some brute force and change one thing without changing a good many others.
If you're trying to control one insect, to use something that isn't necessarily going to wipe out everything in sight.
Yet the public was being asked to accept these chemicals, was being asked to acquiesce in their use, and did not have the whole picture. So I set about to remedy the balance there.
That she did. Her testimony on Capitol Hill led to chemical controls and the ban of DDT. The environmental lure of Rachel Carson's homestead attracted presidential candidate Al Gore in 2000.
And the main lesson that I took away from it was that there are problems that we can cause for the environment that are not immediately obvious to the naked eye.
This is a 4-room farmhouse, typical of this period.
Visitors to the homestead marvel at the original 4 rooms in which the Carson family lived. At the top of this narrow staircase, in this room, a little girl began to formulate ideas that would bloom in the winter of her life. Rachel Carson died of breast cancer 2 years after Silent Spring was published. But her legacy was already secure, with a warning cry that echoes to this day.
I think we're challenged, as mankind has never been challenged before, to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves.
Visiting a homestead where past and future meet. I'm Dave Crawley.